Hi, third graders. We are back for another reading of Fantastic Mr. Fox. Today we're going to read Chapter 16 and then part of Chapter 17. Before we start reading today, we're going to review what we read yesterday with Miss Walsh. We know that Badger started to feel guilty that they were stealing from the other farmers, but Mr. Fox reminded him that anyone would do the same thing if their children were starving and in the same situation. Badger got on board, and then they decided to head to Mr. Bean's cider cellar, which was in the basement of Bean's actual home. And they were going to get cider for the feast. As they were getting the cider, and they were marveling over it, they heard footsteps coming down the stairs to the cellar, and that's where we left off, as they were inside Bean's cellar, and they heard footsteps coming down the stairs. So today we're going to work on comparing and contrasting. We have done this throughout the school year in many different stories that we've read. As a reminder, comparing means we're talking about what's the same about different events or things, and contrasting means talking about what's different about different events or things that we're reading about. So today our big question is, how was the visit to Bean's cellar different from that of the visits to Bogus and Bunce's? How is it the same, and how is it different? And we're going to use evidence from the text. So we know we've already gone to Bogus and Bunce's house to get the food for the feast. Today we're going to read about when Mr. Fox and the Badger go to Bean's cellar, and we're going to talk about what's the same about those visits to the different farmers' houses and what is different, okay? One vocabulary word that we're going to focus on today that we're going to see in our story is the word brute. A brute is a savagely violent person or animal. Chapter 16. The Women. "Quick," said Mr. Fox, "hide!" He and the Badger and the smallest fox jumped up on a shelf and crouched behind a row of big cider jars. Peering around the jars, they saw a huge woman coming down into the cellar. At the foot of the steps, the woman paused, looking to right and left. Then she turned and headed straight for the place where Mr. Fox and Badger and the small fox were hiding. She stopped right in front of them. The only thing between her and them was a row of cider jars. She was so close. Mr. Fox could hear the sound of her breathing. Peeping through the crack between two bottles, he noticed that she carried a big rolling pin in one hand. "How many will you want this time, Mrs. Bean?" the woman shouted, and from the top of the stairs the other voice called back, "Bring up 2 or 3 jars." "He drank 4 yesterday, Mrs. Bean." "Yes, but he won't want that many today, because he's not going to be up there more than a few hours longer. He says the fox is bound to make a run for it this morning. It can't possibly stay down in that hole another day without food." The woman in the cellar reached out and lifted a jar of cider from the shelf. The jar she took was next but one to the jar behind which Mr. Fox was crouching. "I'll be glad when that rotten brute is killed and strung up on the front porch," she called out. "And by the way, Mrs. Bean, your husband promised I would have the tail as a souvenir." "The tail's been all shot to pieces," said the voice from upstairs. "Didn't you know that?" "You mean it's ruined?" "Of course it's ruined. They shot the tail but missed the fox." "Oh, heck," said the big woman. "I did so want that tail." "You can have the head instead, Mabel. You can get it stuffed and hang it on your bedroom wall. Hurry up now with that cider." "Yes, ma'am, I'm coming," said the big woman, and she took a second jar from the shelf. "If she takes one more, she'll see us," thought Mr. Fox. He could feel the smallest fox's body pressed tightly against his own, quivering with excitement. "Will 2 be enough, Mrs. Bean, or shall I take 3? "My goodness, Mabel, I don't care, so long as you get a move on." "Then 2 it is," said the huge woman, speaking to herself now. "He drinks too much anyway." Carrying a jar in each hand, and with the rolling pin tucked under one arm, She walked away across the cellar. At the foot of the steps, she paused and looked around, sniffing the air. "There's a rat down here again, Mrs. Bean. I can smell it." "Then poison them, woman, poison them. You know where the poison's kept." "Yes, ma'am," said Mabel. She climbed slowly out of sight, up the steps. The door slammed. "Quick," said Fox. "Grab a jar each and run for it." Rat stood up on a high shelf and shrieked. "What did I tell you? You nearly got nabbed, didn't you? You nearly gave the game away. You keep out of here from now on. I don't want you around. This is my place. You," said Mr. Fox, "are going to be poisoned." "Oh, poppycock," said Rat. "I sit up here and watch her putting that stuff down. She'll never get me." Mr. Fox and Badger and the small fox ran across the cellar, clutching a gallon jar each. "Goodbye, Rat," they called out as they disappeared through the hole in the wall. "Thanks for the lovely cider." "Thieves!" shrieked Rat. "Robbers! Bandits! Burglars!" So we're going to pause here before we go on to chapter 17. I want you to think to yourself, how was the visit to Bean's cider cellar different from the other visits, and how is it the same? So we know that he's visited Boggis's chicken house and Bunce's storefront with the geese and the ham and the ducks. And now today we read about Mr. Fox and Badger visiting Bean's cider cellar. How are they the same, the visits, and how are they different? Pause the video and think to yourself for a moment, and then press play when you're ready to discuss. So how are these visits the same? We know that at all three of the farmers' houses, Mr. Fox was really trying to get supplies for the feast so that everyone could enjoy them. At Boggis and Bunce's, he was collecting food, and here he was collecting drinks, but we know that his goal for all three stops was that he could collect food and drinks for the feast. How is it different? This is the first time where he almost got caught, right? And the other two stops, no one was there, and there was really no way he could have gotten caught there. He was very careful of putting the floorboards back. But today, Mabel, the woman, came downstairs and she was very close to them. So there was definitely probably a feeling of anxiousness in Mr. Fox that he hadn't felt before. So how are they the same? He was collecting things for the feast. How are they different? When he went to Bean's cellar, this was the first time that he had almost been caught throughout this whole process. Let's continue reading chapter 17. Chapter 17, The Great Feast. Back in the tunnel they paused so that Mr. Fox could brick up the hole in the wall. He was humming to himself as he put the bricks back in place. "I can still taste that glorious cider," he said. "What an impudent fellow Rat is." "He has bad manners," Badger said. "All rats have bad manners. I've never met a polite rat yet." "And he drinks too much," said Mr. Fox, putting the last brick in place. "There we are now. Home to the feast." They grabbed their jars of cider and off they went. Mr. Fox was in front. The smallest fox came next, and Badger last. Along the tunnel they flew, past the turning that led to Bunce's mighty storefront, past Boggis's chicken house number 1, and then up the long home stretch towards the place where they knew Mrs. Fox would be waiting. "Keep it up, my darlings," shouted Mr. Fox. "We'll soon be there. Think what's waiting for us at the other end. Just think what we're bringing home with us in these jars. That ought to cheer up poor Mrs. Fox." Mr. Fox sang a little song as he ran. "Home again swiftly I glide, back to my beautiful bride. She'll not feel so rotten as soon as she's gotten some cider inside her inside." Then Badger joined too. "Oh, poor Miss Badger," he cried, "so hungry she very nearly died. But she'll not feel so hollow as soon as she'll swallow some cider inside her insides." They were still singing as they rounded the final corner and burst in upon the most wonderful and amazing sight any of them had ever seen. The feast was just beginning, A large dining room had been hollowed out of the earth, and in the middle of it, seated around a huge table, were no less than 29 animals. They were Mrs. Fox and her 3 small foxes, Mrs. Badger and 3 small badgers, Mole and Mrs. Mole and 4 small moles, Rabbit and Mrs. Rabbit and 5 small rabbits, Weasel and Mrs. Weasel and 6 small weasels. The table was covered with chickens and ducks and geese and hams and bacon, and everyone was tucking in the lovely food. So we're going to pause there for today. I want you to think to yourself, though, how do you think Mr. Fox felt when he arrived home? Using evidence from the text supports your answer. So when he arrived home after he had been out collecting food and collecting drinks and meeting Badger, how does he feel when he opens that door and when he walks into that dining room and sees what he sees? I think that Mr. Fox is feeling very proud. He knows that he is kind of the reason that all these people have come together. So when I'm thinking that he's proud, I know that it says that the table was covered with chickens and hens and geese and bacon and ham, and he's the one that collected all of those things. So I think when it talks about seeing all those things on the table, that shows that he's probably feeling very proud. I also think that he's feeling really excited because it says that it was the most wonderful and amazing sight that any of them had ever seen. So I think that he's feeling proud and excited. I know that he's feeling those ways based on evidence from the text. So tomorrow you're going to finish reading chapter 17 and then go on and read chapter 18 with Mrs. Walsh. We'll see you tomorrow.